enjoying other side events. This is a Just and Transition, how a treaty can be vital for justice and peace in Colombia. We are joined by CNEP, the Center for Research and Popular Education Peace Program in Colombia, CAFOD, who are the official aid agency for the England and Wales Catholic Church in the UK, AB Colombia, Christian Aid Ireland, and the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, who are all co-organising this event. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping now before we kick off. Just to begin, my name is Louise and I am the private sector lead policy analyst at CAFOD. We, as I've just introduced CAFOD, we are the official agency of the Catholic Church, aid agency of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. We are part of Caritas International and also part of the CIDSE network. Just to add that I am a non-Spanish speaker, so there'll be multiple interpretation, and we have some other sole Spanish speakers today, so there will be interpretation. I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Emily, who's going to run over the interpretation in English and Spanish.
Hello everyone, welcome today. And just to say, if you want to hear to this English interpretation for this event, on the bottom hand of your screen in Zoom, you can choose interpretation and you can choose English. Buenos días a todos los que nos están escuchando, todas las que nos están escuchando desde Colombia. Si quieren escuchar esta sesión en español y están en Zoom, pueden hacerlo apretando el botón del globo abajo de interpretación y seleccionando el idioma español.
Thanks, Emily. So we're just gonna go over a few other housekeeping points. Panelists will speak for about 5 to 8 minutes. One of the panelists is speaking via a video, pre-recorded video. We will take questions at about 40 minutes in. So if you have any questions, please keep them, put them in the chat, and we will also be sharing solidarity actions you can take as well. We're going to be pasting the Facebook page on which this is being streamed live and hashtags that you can use to show solidarity in the chat. Yes, the event will be transmitted online through a Facebook page, also going to be in the chat. If you're tweeting, please do use those hashtags. So just as an introduction, this side event is around the 7th session of the negotiations for a UN binding treaty on business and human rights, and also just to express solidarity with the communities who are being affected by the situation we're going to be hearing about. So this event is about the struggle to hold transnational corporations to account for human rights abuse, environmental abuse in the global south. And this is something that Pope Francis has said constitutes a new version of colonialism. Cerrejón, the Cerrejón mine is the largest open pit coal mine in Latin America. And for years, the mine has been severely impacting the rights and environment of indigenous, Afro-descendant and farming communities in Colombia. We'll hear particularly about the right to water. The mine was jointly owned by subsidiaries of multinational mining companies, BHP, Anglo-American and Glencore, until 2021 when BHP and Anglo-American sold their interests to Glencore. So now there are further concerns on top of the existing abuse about the accountability in the context of mine closures and the transfer of ownership. We'll be hearing a bit more about that. So we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today. We're going to be hearing testimony from indigenous communities affected by the Cerrejón mining operations and from civil society organizations supporting them. We'll be hearing about how a legally binding instrument with extraterritorial liability could help to regulate and mitigate the negative impacts on these communities' rights and their environment. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers just for brevity. I'm going to introduce them one by one before they speak. So I am, without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, that is Amanda Romero, and this is a pre-recorded video. Amanda is a South America senior researcher and representative for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center based in Bogota in Colombia. And she has many years experience as a human rights researcher and educator. And in her role, she has undertaken business and human rights missions in the region and meetings with NGOs and grassroots communities and with companies. So we're just going to hear Amanda's video now.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Many thanks to CAFOT, CINEP and Peace Program, Christian Aid, and ABC Colombia for inviting me to be here today. Today, we will be talking about the human rights obligations of fossil fuel companies in the Colombian context, and in particular, the responsibilities of a company like Carbones del Cerrejón. First of all, I want to mention that the development over the last 10 years of the legal framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the adoption of its 3 central pillars opened the way to a public debate about the responsibility of the state to protect its citizens against human rights violations committed by companies, as established in Pillar 2, and the obligation of the companies and the state to compensate the victims of environmental and social damage caused directly or indirectly by companies. As a result, we see that communities in this country have lived through a period of 20 years in which voluntarism has prevailed. This voluntarism has been present since the adoption during the first decade of the 21st century of the voluntary principles on security and human rights that translated into 2 mechanisms in Colombia: the Guías Colombia on Business, Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law, and the Mining and Energy Committee on Security and Human Rights, of which the Cerrejón company is part. This type of voluntary measures has not allowed an in-depth analysis of the state's duty to prevent human rights violations linked to business operations. For example, regarding the free, prior, and informed consent and the consultation process, which have to do with analyzing and having access prior to mining concessions being granted on the territories where minerals will be extracted, in this case, coal. Also, over the last 40 years, it has been particularly difficult to access information and transparency, especially information on the history of the companies that are part of Cerrejón concerning human rights violations. However, the most important thing is that these business operations have lacked a previous analysis of the mitigation plans, damage prevention, and the closure of the mining project in the context of the energy transition. The indigenous and Afro-descendant communities that live in the department of La Guajira have been suffering a combination of historical and structural discrimination. This began with a promise of development, but soon became a nightmare for the thousands of inhabitants who saw their water sources disappear in a semi-desert area of the country. This was implemented via legal decrees, political and administrative measures based on titles that were applied to lands that had ancestrally been their natural territory. The response of the communities has been peaceful. They have taken various constitutional and legal actions, as will be explained later, to seek access to justice following serious environmental contamination and situations of generalized violence, which persist in Colombia, despite the signing of peace accords that have not been fully implemented yet. Faced with community demands, companies such as Cerrejón have displayed interesting and sophisticated behavior, including the piloting of a grievance mechanism developed by the recently deceased Professor John Raggi regarding business and human rights policy, as well as making public statements against harassment, intimidation, threats, and killings of human rights defenders. However, the Colombian state has not taken steps to impose these due diligence requirements to prevent human rights violations in the coal supply chain by subcontractors, suppliers, franchises, and other business partners. Despite having committed to respecting the general observations included in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the Advisory Opinion 23 of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on the right to a healthy environment. In this context, we find that, unfortunately, despite the existence of a national plan of action on business and human rights, of which Colombia has already released the second version, the company has responded by saying that it has not committed any kind of human rights abuses and maintains good relations with the communities. However, in the database of attacks on human rights defenders in Colombia, from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, 90% of the attacks registered occur in 4 main areas or sectors: renewable energy, especially hydropower, agriculture and livestock, hydrocarbons and mining. In this sense, the Department of La Guajira was, in that 6-year period, the most affected by complaints of intimidation, threats, and murders, the murders accounting for 71% of the cases registered by the center, and 68.1% of relevant cases relating to women. For this reason, we call for the UN binding treaty that will be discussed this week in Geneva to take into consideration the latest report of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights, on the need for greater protection and due diligence measures, especially in countries like Colombia, which is immersed in situations of environmental, social, and armed conflict. In this sense, it's important to highlight the role of those who defend human rights in situations of conflicts, so communities can achieve their objectives. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks to Amanda, who couldn't join us today, for her contribution there. And we've heard about some of the grave abuses that are being faced by communities and the lack of due diligence and the need for a UN binding treaty on transnational corporations and other business enterprises. So I'm going to hand over now to Angelica Ortiz, an environmental defender of the Wayuu indigenous people in La Guajira. She will share with us some first-hand account of the human rights violations experienced by the communities affected by the Cerrejón mine. These communities have been working to defend their human rights, their water, their environmental, spiritual, and cultural survival for many years. And we're very pleased and very honored to be joined directly by Angelica, who is going to speak about what communities are facing. So over to you.
Bueno, un cordial saludo a todos y a todas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Angelica Ortiz, and I am leader of the Wayuu peoples. I am also part of the Fuerza Mujeres Wayuu. And well, I would like to say that it's been very difficult to defend human rights in a society that is full of corruption. La Guajira locates in the north of Colombia, on the border with Venezuela and the Caribbean Sea. La Guajira has been a department that in the 70s, 80s was very rich, had a huge production in everything related to agriculture, rice, cotton, etc.
Personas que se hacen el imaginario que la Guajira no solamente es desértica. La Guajira se divide entre alta.
The Guajira is not just a desert. La Guajira has two different parts due to the natural conditions of this department. It's got the Rancheria River, which crosses in the middle. And that's why we keep fighting to maintain our water resources, especially El Arroyo Bruno. It hasn't been easy because we have faced lots of threats and intimidation, as Amanda was saying, even though they don't take responsibility for their actions. But there are some investigations that prove this. The Afro-descendants, Wayuu, and farming communities in La Guajira have seen their human rights violated. More than 25 communities, farming Afro-descendants and Wayuu communities, have been wiped out. Only 4 have been resettled. And that's why they say that they are fulfilling with the UN guiding principles and everything related to voluntarism. Unfortunately, these resettlements have been failed. They've seen their living standards changed. They are not producing anymore, they're consuming. And unfortunately, many people in these communities, for example, tobacco, that has been demanding for more than 20 years, and many other communities that I can name today, but unfortunately, they're still trying to fight for their human rights. One of the things I like to mention is social damage. The relation between the communities have been suffering. It's not the same as it was 20 years ago. We carried out a research related to behavior and social activity. And one of the women we interviewed said that today we live closer, but we live far away. And this is due to all the damage we've been suffering. We've been suffering also a spiritual damage. There is no difference between the community and our cultural history. Many people even say that they have stopped dreaming. And this is very important for us, since the Wayuu is very related to their spiritually, and in our culture, dreaming is very important. So much that in the morning, we're not asking others, how did you sleep? We ask, what did you dream of? According to us, what we dream can have an effect on how the day is going to go. The water pollution and the air pollution has also been very important, is very serious. At very high temperatures, coal gets fire. And there are toxic gases around us all the time that comes from firing the coal. It's especially serious in some of the departments that has a white cloud among them. We've also been suffering from the smell of sulfate. Water pollution is very serious. And the company said that we were lying when we were actually saying that the water was polluted. However, there was an investigation that showed that our water is very polluted with different heavy metals that lead to very serious illnesses. I like to say that we had to appeal to these free prior and consultation process after the mining operations happened. There are lots of court rulings with which the mining operation has not complied. And this has led to situations that makes us feel very desperate. Lots of measures have not been applied and our human rights have not been fulfilled. We are now in the middle of a caravan that, thanks to the help of different organizations, is going to get to Bogota to demand our human rights, to demand they are fulfilled. We've been lied. And everything that has been done has nothing to do with the ILO Convention 169 and other principles related to other documents and guiding principles. The UN guiding principles has not been implemented. There is no protection. We don't get any help from the Colombian state. And we haven't got any reparation or compensation from the damages we've suffered. I would also like to say that we are in the middle of the caravan La Guajira habla al país. A lot of people wonder, why this name? Why La Guajira habla al país? The Guajira speaks to the country and not other communities. There are many people talking about the companies to take responsibility for their actions, but we are the ones demanding the companies to do this, to take responsibility for what they've done. We're complaining because they've damaged our territory, and we have to demand to our human rights to be fulfilled. The Woyo communities, Afro-descendants, and farming communities have been suffering for years, and it's time for us to speak out. It is very important for us to get all the support that we can, and especially to get support to fight in these regions that have been affected, that have seen the right to water, the right to food affected. There are lots of things that have been tried to be done, but unfortunately, we're still facing lots of water shortages in the area. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And that was a really powerful testimony. And we really appreciate you joining us today. We will hear more about the solidarity actions that you can take to stand together with these communities at the end of this session. I just want to remind you that if you have any questions for the panelists, please do post them in the chat. We're not using a Q&A box, we're just simply using the chat along the side here. And I'm just going to move us on to our next speaker. So we're now going to hear from Jenny Ortiz Fonseca, who works for the Center for Research and Popular Education Peace Programme CNIP in Colombia, and Jenny accompanies the communities in La Guajira and other communities in Colombia. And CNIP is a Colombian Jesuit organization that's been working for more than 50 years for human rights and sustainable peace in Colombia. And CAFOD have also been working very closely with CNIP for some years. CNIP is very well known nationally and internationally, and for the last 10 years they've been working in La Guajira. They've provided important accompaniment to the indigenous, Afro-descendant and peasant communities there, and have done extensive reporting on human rights and political violence, including participatory research showing systemic human rights violations and large-scale mining. So I'm just going now to hand over to Jenny, who will talk a bit more about the situation there.
Thank you, Louise. Good morning, everybody, sisters and brothers who are with us. I would like to begin by saying Cerrejón is violating human rights, and systematically it has been doing that of the Wayu people and the Afro-descendant communities. It is acting and has been acting with impunity as a corporation, as has been seen in different legal sentences against this multinational company. And the binding treaty in this respect makes sense as a global instrument that will allow us not only to bring preventive proceedings, but also for integral reparation for human rights that have been violated by multinational companies. I'd like to refer to 4 matters that I think are really central in terms of the binding treaty, in terms of this particular case of the mine. First of all, the binding treaty recognizes human rights, including a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So it's important to point out that indigenous communities not only speaking about human rights, but also refer to the rights in terms of nature. And this is one of the aspects of the treaty. These companies are impacting very seriously on the environment, causing more and more damage and requiring environmental restitution and renovation. So it's not only a question of human rights matters, but also rights around nature. And this would allow us to commence a debate on the basis of a much broader question of human rights, understanding that on the one hand, there are human rights and then rights referring to nature. So this is what the communities, Afro-descendant communities, have been analysing their approach. Now, the second matter I'd like to bring up, which I do think is important and it's crucial to bring it up, has to do with the article, particularly Article 4, which refers to the free movement and free processes in terms of ensuring minimal levels of respect for victims of the transnational corporations. Now, this is connected to the following numbers, because a great or a major part of the debates with multinational corporations is that they're regularly called upon to show that their effects have been affected. So there's a difference in terms of the burden of proof, whereas the companies can show that the companies are right, be given their information and their experience. So in terms of the machinery, there is a difference. It's, well, they say that they lie, they say that they hire experts and so on to really discuss on the basis of what is actually true. So in terms of the rights in the treaty for access to justice, and in terms of bringing grievances and complaints for in relation to being deprived of their rights, sounds fine on paper, but in fact really, this is a matter that's extremely complex. Now, one example, currently we are involved in a political dispute in terms of sentence 88, which recognizes the violation of human rights in terms of water, clean environment, and in terms of the Wayu communities and so on. The company has taken action in the Tajo El Puente, but the communities, for example, do not have the right to carry out community monitoring and move freely through the territory to follow up on the extractive activities in the Tajo, which is part of the operations of the companies. So they say that in terms of those rights in land where there is a high level of conflict in Colombia, there's much much fewer possibilities. So there's also the question of access to justice. Cerrejón has got more than 4 sentences, legal sentences against it, which have been passed against it. What we're saying is that these transnational companies co-opt the state, in this case Colombia. So in terms of sentences or process of justice, in terms of the state, there is greater and greater weakness in terms of recognizing the communities and their rights in terms of the Bruno River. These are not considered as part of that matter, even though there has been a sentence which does recognize that. In any case, the process of ecological restitution and so on, well, is a matter of 4 water courses. There's been an impact on forest, and here there's very limited responses. So the reports that have been put forward by the authorities are those prepared by the companies. So there's really a high degree of complicity, which I think is important to point out. A fourth aspect has to do specifically with the question of integral restitution, which Article 4 in terms of the rights of victims. So in the social organizations and communities, we say that this actually involves not only compensation for damage. The YU and communities and Afro descendants say that there's no, you cannot put a price on water because it means life. It's a metaphorical matter of, it's not a metaphorical aspect of talking about growing crops, but water is a system in social terms, as it were. But in terms of these integral restitution processes, in cases such as El Cerrejón, where 3 multinational corporations have start to sell shares. Glencore, at the beginning of this year, an owner of Prudeco, an extractive company in El Cesar, decided to hand over the mining titles to the state, creating a crisis in 3 municipalities in El Cesar. There are no profits in terms of coal, that's part of the issue, but just 2 months ago it said that it was buying the shares of BHP and Anglo Merck. So there was no closure plan in the El Cesar department. We have called for closure plans and plans for environmental restitution, so much more rigorous treatment has to be provided for the in terms of the behavior of multinational companies. They create smaller companies in their groups and they never actually provide integral reparation for damage. And this is also the case of Grumo, another multinational company, which just a couple of weeks ago ratified financing of paramilitary groups and also for the killing of trade union leaders. So they take advantage of areas in which there's conflict or dispute and impoverishing the departments where they really have a huge level of impact. I'd like to close by saying something towards Christian aid, which has to do with access to justice. Companies are not implementing legal decisions. Cerrejón is one key case because after 4 years of extractive activities, what we see as impoverishment, rulings that have not been implemented, communities have to go 1,000 kilometers away to Colombia to actually call for their rights. But number 8 of the binding treaty in particular refers to some matters which I think are very important to mention. In number 8.1, it states that states should ensure that legislation provides an adequate scheme for legal responses. Well, if states are co-opted by companies, no type of legislation at national level will be ensured, but rather flexible solutions will be provided, as is already occurring in the prior consultation case. It's also very difficult in legal national processes, for example, 14, and not 4, the interpreter says, against the rulings against the companies. 3,
I think we might have lost Jenny. So
yeah.
I think we might have lost Jenny's connection, but I think that she was probably nearing the end of her talk. So we'll perhaps, oh, hi, Jenny, I think that you're back. Are we okay to wrap up now and move on to the next speaker? Was anything more to add?
Sí, perdón, se salió un segundo. Simplemente quería señalar.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that even though we do bring legal cases, technical cases and investigations which are rigorous and complaints locally at international level, these are not sufficient. These efforts are not sufficient because the companies do not respond to these violations of human rights. And in this respect, the binding treaty really is much more significant because it allows much greater rigor in terms of dealing with the victims, communities who've been victims of this behavior.
Brilliant, thank you, Jenny, and couldn't agree more with that. So we're just going to move on to our final speaker, who is Guajira. Guajira Colombia is a governance and human rights advisor with Christian Aid Ireland. And Christian Aid Ireland have been supporting partner organisations in Colombia for the last 2 decades and have published widely on the situation of land rights, lessons for the peace process, and the link between Ireland and the Cerrejón case. And today she'll be talking about the obstacles in seeking justice against multinational corporations and how they affect prospects of peace in Colombia, and she'll be highlighting gaps in the current draft of the legally binding instrument on transnational corporations and other business enterprises. So take it away, Guajira.
Thanks, Louise, and I'll try to be brief as I know we're leaving time for questions and answers. Just to start with a quote from the tobacco community in La Guajira, as we give you life in Europe through coal, we are dying. And I want to reiterate as well from other panelists how Cerrejón mine has been operating with impunity for decades. And it's a very clear example of how difficult it is for communities and individuals who are affected by corporate practices to challenge them and to access justice. And especially when structures of these companies are very complex and remote. And Cerrejón is an important example to illustrate this. And as it's been said already, that it's owned by 3 major corporations, and those corporations are based in 3 different jurisdictions. But we as Christian Aid Ireland as well believe that we have a responsibility to ask where our coal is coming from. And there is a direct link with Ireland between Cerrejón, where we have sourced vast proportion of coal from the Cerrejón mine, as well as the fact that the Cerrejón sales arm, the company that sells their coal from Cerrejón to Europe and beyond, is based in Ireland, so benefiting from our low corporate tax rate. And this is a very big problem because it's also depleting taxes that are going towards the Colombian government. But what we have been trying to do, and we have been supporting partners to be calling for justice nationally and internationally for decades. But in January 2021, ChristianAid Ireland, with our partners, we took it to the international level and made complaints to the OECD National Contact Point. And this is a soft level mechanism at the national level, where they are established to try and implement the OECD multinational enterprises guidelines. And it is our best option to hold corporations to account at the moment. But the complaints had to go to 3 different jurisdictions, given the parent companies, that's Switzerland, Australia, and the UK, as well as to Ireland, where the sales arm is based. And we really tried to outline the adverse human rights and environmental impacts that have already been spoken about, the mine's failure to carry out adequate due diligence, and the failure to disclose the impacts of its operations. And this again goes back to the issue of lacking access to information from those who are affected. But there are challenges with this process of trying to access justice through the national contact point. It's quite lengthy, it's quite onerous. Again, it's volunteerism, so it's based on the willingness of companies to engage. And there's none of the conclusions or recommendations are binding, so there is no guarantee for remedy. And this is why we are seeing that communities and individuals who have been affected for so long have still not gotten any remedy. And we are saying that this is just not good enough. It's not good enough. And we need a binding treaty so that law that is holding corporations to account has teeth. The binding treaty won't undermine the soft law mechanisms that are there, but it will really ensure that states are establishing relevant domestic law. And that will in turn, in an ideal situation, and a lot of work will need to be done, is to ensure that those relevant domestic laws are then paying compensation to victims and are then supporting the rehabilitation of the environment and preventing potential further harms. In the case of Colombia, this is very essential also for sustainable peace and preventing any new human rights abuses that have occurred, given the history of armed conflict and the amount of abuse, human rights abuses and violations that have been committed already. To have a binding treaty that helps to prevent any further harms and to also restitute for harms that have been committed, shows a strong progress as well towards helping Colombia's peace. For the binding treaty, although there has been some progress, definitely since the draft, the zero draft in 2018, and we're seeing that there's an acknowledgement there on the barriers to accessing justice and those particular harms that are suffered by women in relation to corporate abuses, and also emphasizing the key role of human rights defenders in holding companies to account. But there is huge room for improvement. And the Irish Coalition for Business and Human Rights, for which ChristianAid Ireland is a member, has set out principles where we really feel should underpin the treaty. And we have put some clear emphasis on the need for administrative, civil and criminal penalties. And this is crucial to ensure that companies do act to respect human rights and are held accountable. And from the civil side, that communities are able to take cases in the jurisdiction where those companies are based. And this is very, very important. But we realize that without political will, this won't even come close. So we are quite concerned that the European Union's opposition to the treaty is preventing sort of full progress in relation to getting this across the line. And we really are pushing for Ireland and other states to continue asking for an EU mandate to negotiate in these treaties, but also for Ireland to be able to share its national position in relation to the treaty, and like other member states already, to engage directly with the treaty in the absence of an EU mandate. And this is extremely important given the number of corporations based in Europe, that we really need these political steps to get the treaty over the line and to be fully implemented at a national level. So what my fellow panelists are talking about, that justice can be achieved and victims will be fully compensated. Thank you.
Thank you, Grania. That's fantastic, and I just want to repeat, what Grania said, that it's not good enough at the moment, that we've seen that voluntary mechanisms aren't sufficient. We're 10 years on from the UN guiding principles, and there just hasn't been enough action. And I think that really is evident from the testimonies that we've heard today. We know that companies from Switzerland, UK, Ireland, Australia are all involved in this case, and that the impacts that are absolutely devastating on human rights and the environment, and also the climate, because we've got coal being produced from this mine. So they're all of these things are very tied up together, and just raise the need for a just transition in all of the different senses of the word just. I think we're running out of time a bit now, so I'm just going to move on to questions from the audience. So if anybody does have any questions, I don't know if we have had any questions from the chat. It doesn't look like there has been. So I will just open the floor in case anybody would like to ask their question in person. If not, we do have a couple of questions that we can ask the panelists. So we've got one question from Leah. So go ahead, Leah, do you want to ask your question? Sorry, Leah, would you be able to put your question in the chat? I think that's how we're managing this. In the meantime, before we have that question, maybe we could just ask the possibly a question to Angelica or to Jenny. What do you want to happen in terms of mine closures, the possibility of mine closures? What would be the best scenario for communities? And perhaps if you could talk a bit more about the solidarity actions that communities could take as well, that the international community can take in solidarity with the caravan this week. So I think that we now have Leah unmuted. So sorry, go ahead, Leah. You can ask your question, and then we'll come back to Angelica and Jenny.
Thanks very much. My question was for Angelica as well. Thank you all very much for the presentation. It's really interesting to hear. I work for an organization that works specifically on the issue of corporate courts. So investor to state dispute settlement, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which is a provision within trade deals that enables corporations to sue governments if they do something that affects the potential future profits of those corporations. And you'll likely know that Glencore and Anglo American are taking cases against the state of Colombia, particularly over the Bruno River, part of the Cerrejón mine. And so I was wondering what, if any, the impact of the bringing of this case has been in the community, if there is awareness of that, and how the community sees those actions by the corporations and the states in the global north that host them. Thanks.
I wonder if, Grania, would you be able to take that question? We'll start with your response, and if anyone else wants to come in, they will be able to.
I think it was for Angelica.
Oh, sorry, yes, Angelica.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Bueno, para la pregunta que acaban de hacer sobre el tema del arroyo Bruno.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Related to the Bruno stream, I would like to say that it's been diverted in 7 kilometers. They wanted to divert it 20 kilometers between 2027. And there's been a court ruling after an appeal made of these communities that do not agree with this. Cerrejón only held a previous consultation with one of the regions in this department, even though there are lots of different communities that live around this river and base their life in this river. So we are demanding that this river is protected. There are different court rulings from the Constitutional Colombian Court, and what we're doing is to demand that this river is back to their natural course. Unfortunately, this has been very difficult for communities because the Constitutional Colombian Court ruling says that there should be a round table with the participation of the communities. However, this hasn't been the case. Communities have been non part of these round tables. This court ruling that I was talking about from the 2017 didn't have any impact because it hasn't been complied with it, either by the company or other institutions. We think there should have been a different answer to this topic in order to sort out everything that has not been dealt with by the Constitutional Court. What we want, as I said, is the River Bruno to go back to its natural course, because there's already been a damage to our fauna and flora because of this diversion. We found different animals that have been dead along the course of the river, and this is also something to take into account. There are some animals that have been going to this river for years and they are used to it. So that's why we think this is also a problem to think about. We want to have some certainty. This is what we are demanding. However, the company is saying that the loss will be, their economic loss will be too big. But we don't really care about this. What we care is about our cultural and spiritual damages, the ones we have been suffering because of the company. I don't know if Jenny wants to say anything else from this. Yes, I want to say two things. Firstly, Glencore and Anglo American started a process against the Colombian state because their commercial rights were violated. in relation to the diversion of the Bruno stream. In the middle of this process, it was important to mention that the Colombian state needs to give an answer. However, the answer has been to try to co-opt the communities and put pressure on them without a consultation process. And it led to a court ruling that has 8 principles regarding the diversion of this river Bruno, in which the communities have not participated. That's why the communities decided to demand their participation. CINEP, Terra, and other technicals that have participated in these court rulings have not participated either. Sorry, we're facing some technical problems. And some people will think, well, why is the river Bruno such a problem? Well, so all is interlinked in this department. Every time we make some of these streams disappear, we are having an impact on the Rancheria River. And this has increased the pressure on different communities. Communities have been threatened, intimidated, and they have been suffering violence from the communities and third parties. And we're still in a process of conflict with the communities and the state. We can live without coal, but we can't live without water. And this is related to the high level of humanitarian crisis that we're living in the department of La Guajira. We can reach the 38, 40, 42 degrees and we have no water. We are in a semi-arid region and we have no water. Also because of COVID, the water resources are more important than ever. The water, as one of my colleagues was saying, has no price. It's priceless. However, Glencore and Anglo American, BHP, they say that the economic losses are too big and they still not comply with the court rulings that they should.
Thank you, Jenny and Angelica. That was really fantastic. And it would be great for one of you to talk about solidarity actions that we can all take, and just to remind everybody in the chat of what we can do to support communities. I just want to first, if we can go over for about 5 minutes, ask if there are any other questions that anybody has for any of the panelists. If you could write it in the chat if you do have a question. I don't think there are any questions at the moment, so I'm just going to pose one to Grania. Sorry, just go ahead, Jenny. And Angelica.
No, yo quisiera,
Vale, dale, Jenny, sigue.
para que Angélica cierre. Yo quisiera pues aprovechar.
For closing, just to use this opportunity to talk about the transition, because the Department of La Guajira, it's becoming a very important area. We have been seeing how coal has been extracted. We've seen different mining operations that are as big as Cerrejón and that are in other regions of La Guajira. We also have more than 32 wind farms. And we've got some fracking projects that will happen in the future of green and blue hydrogen. However, it is at the same time the second poorest region in Colombia. However, there are lots of energy companies that are based in this department. We think it's very important the solidarity with the Afro-descendants and indigenous communities that are suffering the impacts now and will in the future. So that's why it's also very important to raise awareness about climate change. the Wayu communities and Afro-descendant communities have been witnessing how their children are dying because of malnutrition or the lack of water. Thousands of children are in danger of dying because of malnutrition. That's why I make a very important call upon different international organizations to think about what we can do with these energy transitions. We're still extracting coal, but now we also want to get wind and solar energy. It is going to become a very important region for this energy transition, and that's why this is very important. These companies have to be held to account for their actions, and not just the ones related to coal, but also other companies, among others, Italian companies. I don't know if Angelica wanted to say something else. Okay, well, I just wanted to talk about the copper mine that has been authorized to happen in La Guajira, on the border with the Cesar. This mine will have the same size of Cerrejón, and will also have different impacts on the environment and the communities that live there. For us, the indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, it's very important to get solidarity from international countries, especially from those countries where the mining companies are based. We are giving energy to all different countries, and I think we need the help from these countries in exchange. This is very important for us because this energy that you get has an impact on our region. One of the things that can be done is to create different campaigns in Europe to raise awareness about the use of the energy, and also to participate in different campaigns as civil society. It is also important to get some support to be able, as indigenous communities, to tour around different areas in order to raise awareness among the general public, in order for them to know what is happening in La Guajira, and for them to know all the impacts that this company is having on us, but to know about this from us and not from the mining companies. From one person that says that these mining operations don't have any impact, there are hundreds of thousands of people that say that they do. That's why we're trying to call for solidarity and the empathy of all of you about what we're suffering in our territory. Thank you very much to everyone to let me explain to all of you what is happening in La Guajira. And thank you to everyone, because our caravana La Guajira Habla el País is taking place and it will be very successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelica. And I know that we are quite over time now, so we're going to wrap up with a final quickfire question to Grania, and also also a reminder, if Angelica, if you could also remind us of the actions that we can take to support communities as they are traveling to Bogota and ahead of the public hearing in Bogota this week. How can we support you in that? So first, I'm just going to pass over to Grania. Just a quick question, if you could answer in about 30 seconds, Grania. What do you want? You mentioned international companies with links to the abuses in La Guajira. What do you want these companies, for instance, the Irish companies involved, what do you want them to do?
Well, I suppose particularly with the Irish company, with the electric supply board, we are really looking for them to make sure that they are having human rights policies, obviously, which they think have subsequently created, but really to integrate human rights due diligence into their operations. And they talk about their just transition here in Ireland, but not calling for just transition throughout their supply chain. So we recognize that, as been said already, the impacts on employees, the impacts on communities when there can be either abrupt sales of the mine like Cerrejón, or an abrupt closure that's not free, that's not fair. And we're really calling for the ESB to push for that, and for Ireland to obviously to establish legislation to ensure both businesses and state-owned businesses are establishing human rights due diligence and implementing it.
Thanks, Grania. And we know that national legislation is also complementary to a UN binding treaty. So we know there's international momentum for that in Europe and exactly. and in other countries. So just to finish up, I want to just pass back over to Angelica just to give us a reminder of, just for 30 seconds, Angelica, very quickly, if you could just tell us how we can support the communities this week with the caravan in Bogota and in ahead of the public hearing later this week. How can we express our solidarity?
Bueno, como hoy llega la caravana
well, the convoy will reach Bogota today. The communications people are getting ready to put this up on social media, including Twitter, talking about what's actually happening in Bogota. The communities, their representatives have reached the city calling for their rights. I think today and this week, what's important is to disseminate the information also to embassies and communicate with the headquarters. This is happening in Colombia because the shareholders of the companies know what's happening in the country, because in different meetings they've spoken, and the information that they have has come from, in some cases, from the company. So this is a way to support people in the civil society, and also for those in the multinational headquarters to understand what's happening and that this has to stop. In terms of the plan to close the mine, we need to kick off with a campaign looking at what the communities are proposing in terms of that closure, planned closure, so that we do not have to experience what was experienced in El Cesar department.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and thank you to the other panelists that we've heard from today. I hope that you've all found the event interesting. Please do share on social media what's happening in La Guajira, and there are hashtags in the chat that you can use on Twitter and social media. And yeah, please do also call on your respective agents, embassies and policymakers to take action on this, and also call for a strong binding treaty this week. We've heard that there are many states that are supportive of the process, but there are also some, unfortunately, the UK and the US among them, that are disrupting the process. So we really need everybody to be taking action this week to call on your governments to support the treaty and support those communities who will be massively impacted if that is to come to fruition. So just thank you so much again to our speakers, and we'll just close the event here, and we have recorded the event, and it should be, we'll make it